Thank you so much, every one of you, for engaging with things that are very dear to my heart and I think very important missiologically. The examples showed seem to also highlight the ways that engaging in music communally have the power to subvert traditional power structures. Can you please discuss this apparent relationship between music, advocacy, and power? Should this relationship be expected to be consistent across cultures?
Well, it is true that music is used in the context where I've studied to subvert certain power structures, and it's intentionally built that way so that people have redress, they have ways of confronting power that may be used inappropriately. And certainly it will depend on the audience, the rest of the community, as to whether what they're doing is considered acceptable and whether it's useful. But there are many contexts, as our commentator told us, that it might be quite different than that too. So I think this is one aspect.
How would we, thank you very much. How would you see that?
Yes and no. I mean, it all depends on the cultural context in which the music occurs and the medium that it has in that context. So, what I would say from my observations is that African cultures more broadly do collective music. And that collective music is a powerful tool within those cultures to communicate messages that are important to them. It's really a mixed bag in the Pacific. In some places, music is very important. In other places, it's really not. And there are other means of communication. Dance, for example, would probably be much stronger in the islands where we were than music would be. And the music was very unimaginative and very much just more narrative in terms of its form and so on. So the medium is the form, whatever people have, and the message that they use with it. And the African examples are powerful. I think they're wonderful, but I don't think you can generalize them to global cultures. I think you have to study and find out what's going on.
That's why there's 10 volumes. Ruth, would you like to respond?
I was going to say one other context across Africa where people often confront power is through praise singing. I think that was mentioned earlier in the conference. But where people don't just praise a ruler, but they critique what's going on. They flatter, but they also ask for change. And so praise singing is a very important form that you see across particularly West Africa.
Thank you. Would you also speak about the double entendre that goes on in singing across Africa, or in your context?
Yes, it's really important to study the text. Sometimes as ethnomusicologists, we go and record the sound. We get real caught up in transcribing the sounds, putting them into our own interpretive structures. But those texts are super important, and you need to not only understand the indigenous language, but you need to understand the meanings that may go back very many generations and try to understand what people are saying, because so often there are multiple meanings implied, and not everybody in the audience is going to know them. So you can't ask one person, but you have to ask a variety of participants and try to discern what's really going on with the meaning here.
That seems to, thank you very much. I find that helpful, and it goes close to what I discovered in my work among the Senefo, is that in their singing and in their proverbs and their storytelling, there's a deep language. And could you speak to the concept of deep language? I think you were getting very close to it. I'd like to have you just unpack that a little bit more, because we tend to think, well, it's just what's said.
Right. One of the forms of deep language that's very prominent in the area where I work are proverbs. These are very pithy statements that summarize a truth. Often they are funny. They are meant to teach a moral. but people use them to communicate really deep ideas, and they often throw them around in court cases when somebody's arguing a point. People will argue them as politicians. They will quote a proverb, and then there will be surprise by people who are enjoying how it's been used. Somebody's been really clever about using it. So there are lots of interesting proverbs. I think that's really deep language. There's also sometimes in something as simple as children's songs, deep language there that the children have no idea about the meanings, but the elders know what these songs mean.
That's right. Yes, Sherwood.
The idea of deep language is fascinating. When I heard James Grable on Wednesday evening or Wednesday afternoon, I saw that speech was a possibility for art. And that is exactly what I found in Micronesia.
Yes.
That the speech was elaborated, that people loved the gift of language, that they basically had great honor for people who used it exceptionally well. They were recognized and renowned because of their capacity. But it was not in a proverbial way. It was in a story.
Yes.
They would tell powerful stories. They would tell them in such a way that they were compelling and people were caught by them. And I don't remember any of I learned the language and learned to speak it, and there were no proverbs that I could find. I didn't really go out and hunt for them, but I didn't hear them. People weren't talking about them. But story was continually found. It was resurfaced all the time. And there was this dynamic speech was something that they valued highly. So it's a very interesting thing.
Thank you. Notice that we're talking about a mixture of art forms. We automatically move into that. Ruth, would you talk to us about the struggles we have as ethnomusicologists, where I have been at conferences where we've tried to say, how can we go beyond the limitation of music? And why would we feel wrapped up or, we're boxed in? And we want people to know it's much broader than that.
Right. Well, I think we have to look to the cultures where we're studying, because so often the forms embody multiple forms of performance. I think
simultaneously.
I think of the Way epic that I study, Way Manipule, the book.
One of your books?
Yeah, the second book.
Dried Millet.
Dried Millet Breaking.
Dried Millet. I got it.
Yeah. Ding Balaka Wesha. That's the
that's the real
that's used at the end of the episode. So in your epic performance, you have singing, you have storytelling, you have proverbs that are inserted in the story. You have instrumental performance that's going on. You have the chorus singing, and all of it communicates a deep story about the migration of the Kwela people from the grasslands area all the way down to the coast.
Excuse me, is that historical?
It is in a broad way.
Yes, our dean he says history matters. So I want
It's not specifically historical in the same way the Sunjata epic is in other parts of West Africa, but it certainly does speak to that. Way, the hero, is always transporting his family, and he's constantly running into things that are stopping him. Sometimes a vine grows up in his way, sometimes a spirit confronts him, but he's always moving. Sometimes his family's in an airplane, but it moves at the same speed that they also walk, so it's kind of interesting.
Yes, okay. So ethnomusicology is much broader than just musical sound. Absolutely. We find ourselves studying all the arts forms, and that's partly why we call it global arts here, because ethnomusicology is not understood as broadly as we would like to have it be. May I ask you, too, about the whole issue of, you studied with Alan Merriam, who I consider, he's one of the founders of American, the American Society of Ethnomusicology. And I remember reading from him in his The Anthropology of Music, the whole notion of continuity and change. And we encounter change so much today. It's easy for us to assume, well, everybody can get on Facebook, but not everybody thinks the same way as they are engaging change. Could you talk to us about continuity and change, and then we'll expand that into your area.
Change is something that came into, I think, American ethnomusicology. Perhaps in the 70s, we became more interested in this because earlier, what the comparative musicologists in Germany, our predecessors, were looking for were the kind of beginning forms. What's the source of this music? Where does it come from? And so you were always looking for that ur form.
Yes.
We are much more interested in taking what we find and looking at how it moves. And in the global world we live today, the diaspora, it's dizzying what's going on with music. You have musicians in Philadelphia singing, recording, sending their music onto Facebook, elsewhere, Liberians hearing it, responding, musicians traveling back and forth, Australia, they'll play everywhere in the world. So how do you deal with that change that is promoted there? War breaks out. People have to move to new areas. Refugee camps become permanent settlements. We all know where those exist in Kenya, Ghana, wherever, Sudan. And so change is just a big part of our world today. And we as ethnomusicologists absolutely have to look at it square on as we see it and look to interpret it, particularly with help from the local people, and see how they're understanding it.
Yes. Yes. Thank you. Judith.
I was just thinking when I listened to her, remember in the cohort when
Our DMIS cohort.
when one of the students was going to be doing it on an Ethiopian singer.
Yes.
And I didn't know anything about this man, but he was on YouTube.
That's right.
And so I could just go right on YouTube and find him. And I thought, wow, I mean, this is the change that you're talking about, where it's just instantly, at least I can get an acquaintance with it.
Right. And I was just going to say the change that's taken place in our field. When I was a doctoral student many years ago, I proposed to use videotape, black and white, reel-to-reel videotape to record. The SSRC questioned me, how could these people possibly view this videotape? Can they look at this and understand it?
Oh,
We wouldn't ask that same question today.
we better not.
I have a question for you. I loved the video that you did showing the young group doing the Ebola songs, and then so obviously there's much more than the choirs today in Liberia, and what you show us there is this dramatic change. How would you say that is that change affecting the church? Is that kind of music coming into the church, or is it basically the public where you see that?
The change is definitely coming into the church. I think it was around lunch yesterday I was talking about how music has changed so dramatically. The churches, of course, started out with the hymns, and then the African-American spirituals became prominent, and then gospel music became prominent. Hip-hop, you take whatever's going on and it gets translated into church settings, and the musicians in the churches where I've studied, they come back to the U.S. and meet with counterparts here to find out, what are you people doing in your music? And they take it back. Likewise, African-American musicians go to Liberia to see what's happening. My colleague, Melanie Burnham, who's an ethnomusicologist, came to visit me in Liberia, and I said, what church should we go to today? And I said, Baptist, where do you want to go? Oh, she said, let's go to that Lutheran church where you're studying. And she was shocked to hear the African-American spirituals prominent, the hymns much more in the background. So the missionaries would have had it the other way around, and they are still there, but they're not in the front, let's say.
Thank you. And one last question that finally came in. Dr. Stone, given that you have observed Liberian uses of music over time, how has the usage of music changed generationally?
Well, the example you saw of Julie Endy performing that Ebola song, that's palm wine style. That's the elders, the older people. If I had had enough time, I would have played you Hipco and how the hip hop artists addressed the Ebola crisis. So the younger people are using those forms of music, composing, adapting from hip hop. It's not quite the same, but each generation has its own music. And the thing you find is because of the war, many people have not had a chance, even back in the villages, to sustain some of the forms such as the last dance that I played because they were displaced. But interestingly enough, after the war, some people had more music going on of the traditional. Why? Because after the warlords and the soldiers would come through their area, they had more time to sing and play. They didn't have video. They didn't have electricity. So there were some high points from the war, oddly enough. So things like riddling came back into vogue, and I had not been able to find that in the late 80s. But in 2007, they were doing riddling again.
Wonderful. Thank you very much. I want to say that we're going to continue on, and this has been most informative.
I just asked one last. I just wanted to ask her one last question. Do you know how many days these women marched?
I do not, but we could certainly find it out by checking. It's well documented on various sites. You can Google it because Lame got the Nobel Prize for being instrumental in this. It's well known.
One concluding thought is that there are many genres of music within any one culture, and often in mission we tend to, or at least my experience has been, we look for one genre that will work to communicate the gospel. And we need to be aware and do our ethnographic research and find out how people are interacting and communicating while they're at it. Thank you.
Mi yete shenido